Steve? Can't connect to the server. Is it a problem or should we just ignore it? The RTMP flash error.
We'll just click the buttons again.
Ah.
And then go here and do the same thing.
There we go. No complaints this time. So, welcome James to Kodsnack, Code Chat. Well, actually it turns out Microsoft has a podcast called Code Chat now, so...
Okay, did you come first?
We came first. Well, in my mind I translated it to Code Chat and I thought, I wonder if that sounds sensible in English or is it just to me, but turns out...
Well, be careful, I think they have more lawyers than you.
Oh yeah, I'm afraid so. One or two more perhaps?
Yes.
Yeah. So, you used to be at Docker, or, well, however to put it, like...
I was at Docker. I was one of the early employees when it went from .cloud, which was the PaaS company, to Docker.
Yeah.
I was there for a little under a year, possibly. And my primary role when I was there was to think about two things. One was helping Solomon Hykes sort of run the open source community and get a bunch of things organized around that, and documentation and all of that sort of stuff for heading towards the 1.0 launch of Docker.
Yeah.
And also commercializing the software and building a sort of services and sales and support model around it.
Yep. And now you're at a Kickstarter.
That's right. I've been there just over a year.
Ah.
Yep.
So I was thinking it sounds like kind of a big switch. It's sort of going from like working with the infrastructure to sort of infrastructure consumption, perhaps.
Yeah. So I think the last couple of companies I worked at. Docker and Puppet Labs, both heavily infrastructure companies in the back end of things.
Yeah.
Not really retail companies, whereas Kickstarter is obviously a retail web property.
Yeah.
But it's something that I'm sort of fairly deeply interested in as a product.
Yeah.
I'm actually was a fairly big user of Kickstarter prior to working there.
Yeah.
And it's also local to me, so it's
nice.
They're based in Greenpoint, which is a few minutes from my house. So whereas in my previous life I spent a significant amount of time in aeroplanes, in my new life I spend a little bit of time in the subway and then I'm at work. So that's very pleasant.
That's a nice step.
But it's also nice to be doing something for a mission-oriented company. So Kickstarter is not a for-profit company like most ones. It's a public benefit corporation. So it's
oh really?
We obviously make money, but the objective is actually to do social good. So in this case, to generate social capital by building creative projects.
Yeah, that was new to me. I don't know are most people aware of that?
The actual formal public benefit corporation change happened a month or so ago.
Oh.
Prior to that, we were what's called a B Corp, which is like essentially you have the same you're at the same sort of values you articulate, that you have a mission and you want to do things, but you're not legally bound to do it. We actually changed the constitution of the company to make it us legally bound to do the right thing, instead of traditional company is really designed to maximize value for the shareholders. Our objective is to maximize public benefit or social capital in this case.
Yeah. So you find yourself thinking these days about quite different problems than previously at Docker and
I think sometimes that there's some strong similarities there. If you think about it, what Kickstarter does is a product. What Docker has is a product. There's a lot of similar parallels there. Product management doesn't change very much. It's a different way of looking at the world. Like a retail web property is a different way of looking at the world. But you're still trying to, we're still trying to persuade people to use Kickstarter. That's marketing, and we're still trying to, sell people on the concept, and that's sales, and we're still trying to build a product, and so that means talking to customers and getting requirements and understanding what people need, and it's just a slightly different focus.
Yeah. Little switches here and there. So do you think Docker has succeeded at what it should be and what it's doing?
I guess it's an interesting question. I guess it depends how you define the success, right?
Yeah.
in terms of a brand and as a way of thinking about the change in the industry, it certainly succeeded. I don't think people were thinking about immutable infrastructure, about lightweight containers and things like that very much beforehand. This might have been a small group of people who cared about this, high performance computing people, but it wasn't a mainstream concept.
No.
And I think that Docker has made it a mainstream concept. As to where the product is, if you look at how far Docker's come since sort of 1.0 onwards, it's pretty incredible. I don't think the product is there yet in terms of there are lots of moving pieces in order to make a product sort of really simple and just a drop-in sort of thing, and to make it applicable to a lot of different workloads. I think it's probably the sort of product market fit is not quite there yet, but that's more just a maturity and the length of the project.
It will come naturally.
Chronic failing or anything like that.
Unless you start doing like big mistakes somehow.
Yeah, and I'd be surprised. I think the community is now large, and Docker's done a very good job of governing the community. They have a governance board, and they have a fairly active open source community. I think it would be hard to derail too far at this point.
Do you think? I mean, is there sort of a natural next or a few next steps for Docker, like in 2 months it should be this, or in 6 months or a year?
I think the logical step. So Docker was very focused when it was built on the sort of unit of the container. Sort of infrastructure running an application inside a container. The next logical step, from my point of view, is to move up the stack to manage lots of containers and applications and services. So work around things like Docker Swarm and Docker Compose and Machine, and outside in other parts of the community, things like Kubernetes and things like tools like that, Mesos and Mesosphere, integration with sort of platform as a service products, sort of heading in that direction. So I suspect that 6 months from now, I don't think people will starting to measure Docker's capabilities not about managing individual containers as a unit of compute, but managing clusters of containers as an application. And a lot of the work that's being done right now is designed to sort of move in that direction. So
is the container level solution kind of finished, or should it?
I think it is pretty much finished. There's a few rough edges, like the latest release added a lot more networking support that wasn't there previously. Support for storage backends and things like that. That answers a lot of people's concerns about the sort of that container manageability. And there'll be lots more nice to have features, but I don't see any mission critical missing features currently. Might be some ways that change deployment to the way that containers are executed. Good example of that is currently there's a Docker daemon as to whether there should always be a daemon or whether a container should be a self-contained executable. That may necessitate a change, but I don't think it fundamentally changes the API or the way Docker containers are executed.
The basic solution is solid. I'll start with a loose version of this. I'll detail it if it's needed. Who should be thinking about Docker? Who should be aware of Docker?
I think there are two groups that really need to start thinking about Docker. One of those groups is sort of the application development community, and they've paid a lot more attention. I suspect though it's still probably early adopter community. Like I think that a conference like this, which is heavily Microsoft and heavily the Java world, this is probably something that's sort of touching people's periphery, not actually inside their way of thinking. And I think those people need to think about that because they're the ones that fundamentally suffer from the key problem of I have code, it's on my machine, I want that code to run somewhere where it makes me some money when it ends up in production. And I want to have that happen very seamlessly. I want to be low friction. And those people are still trying to solve those problems. And, I mentioned Microsoft before. That one of the things that I think has been really interesting about the take-up of Azure, for example, is that its integration with Visual Studio. So you can just basically go into Visual Studio and say, here's my application. I would like to launch it on a compute instance in Azure, and I'll click one button and it's done. That's incredibly powerful
Yeah,
because you
that's
actually
where we
see
want
the
to be.
end product to be, and that's what I think that where for a lot of application developers, Docker will get them not all of the way there, but some of the way there towards making that sort of step. And the second group is really people doing production operations.
Oh, yes.
And they need to start thinking about their application developers are going to start using this tool or already are using that tool. You have to come to terms with it being part of your environment and how do you manage it and deploy it and make it part of your, make it production ready for your environment.
Yeah. And that's, one of those people on the periphery. That's definitely me. I mean, I'm starting to get sort of a feel of, yes, it solved this problem. That's really interesting. It's probably very applicable to what we do, but I'm not sure quite where to start. We have this product already. Should I be starting to think in some particular way about how I develop to sort of start adapting my mind to it?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the really interesting things about Docker is that it sort of encourages a new way of thinking about architecture. And I'm certainly not a microservices fanboy. I don't think every solution needs to be a microservice. In fact, a lot of monolithic applications are very effective and perfect for their jobs. But it does start to think about, even if you're not thinking about microservices themselves, it does set you thinking about your application architecture in terms of redundancy and resilience and what are the pieces that make it up. I think a lot of the challenge you have when you have a very large monolith is it's very easy to make a change at one end of the monolith that has an unintended consequence on the other end of the monolith.
Oh, yes.
Add to that the layers of things like operational security and monitoring and all of those sort of things where you, developer changes the way a particular socket works, but doesn't realize you need to update a bunch of firewall rules.
Oh, yes.
And all of a sudden you deploy to production and it doesn't work.
Oh, yeah.
I think Docker it allows you to sort of introspect a lot of that stuff and define a lot of that stuff. I think that's a very interesting, that's going to provide a very interesting perspective for a lot of developers.
Yeah. So let's say, just hypothetically, that we have a rather, maybe not exactly one monolith, maybe two monoliths or something that make up a system we use. Would a natural way to start thinking about Docker be to wrap up each monolith in a container, or to start thinking about hacking things apart in some particular way?
In some cases, depends how big the monolith is, right? If you talk about hundreds of thousands of lines of code, then it's probably not going to run in a container.
No? Okay.
But if you think about the monolith is probably made up of some sets of services, a good example here is we're heavy users of Elasticsearch. That's something that very easily could be dropped into a container. Memcache, Redis, things like that are on the periphery of the monolith. There are things that you can easily start to split out and put into containers. Often your monolith is not as monolithic as you think. It's modular in many ways. So you think about the fact that maybe it's modular in a web tiered kind of way. So it's web server, application server, database server.
Yes.
You can run all the web servers instead of running those as standalone hosts. You can run them in containers. Same with application servers and things like that. So you start with a more physical architecture, and then if that works, then you can look at the more logical architecture inside individual application modules and components. Yeah,
because when I started thinking about it, I realized that one of the rather monolithic things we have, it probably would fall apart very neatly into smaller services, because the main reason they're all there is that it was convenient to put them there. But they're still very isolated things, and when you try to look at them as a whole, they communicate in really weird ways.
Yeah, and you'll see this quite often on an application server, right? There'll be 20 services that run on the server that make up that application. And they're already services. They may be that they are Memcache and Redis and Elasticsearch. They already exist there and they're already configured there. And they exist on the same machine because it was really simple, right? You didn't need to worry about networks and ports or things talking to one another. Or it's local to local is really easy. If everywhere in your code, Memcache is referred to by localhost port number, then that doesn't require a lot of thinking. Whereas if you actually put it on a separate machine, you have to start thinking about managing that machine, managing the connectivity, managing the relationship.
The reason I asked about who should think about Docker is that it occurred to me that it truly is infrastructure on some level. So maybe should there be a future where it sort of disappears completely from you? It's just electricity, Are we sitting around like building our own little power plants right now?
Yeah, I think there is. Anyone who owns an Android phone runs containerized apps right now and have no idea.
Yeah.
I think in the future, you know, I don't. Well, I do, but I don't really understand how. Let's say I you know, I really understand how my phone works, for example. You know, in this case I do, but let's hypothetically say I don't.
Exactly.
Like the vast majority of the people when they launch Google Maps have no idea what's happening there,
yes.
right? They know that somewhere there must be a server somewhere that has all the addresses and must be able to map the addresses to the physical thing and do calculations to work out your routes and all that sort of stuff. But somewhere underneath all of that, there's probably a containerized app of some kind running, or a series of apps. Yes. But the details, I don't really care. And I think application developers need to know a bit more, but honestly shouldn't really have to worry about the fact. They should just be like, there's compute resources available, I can consume them.
Yeah. Maybe somewhere on the level of, I mean, adding networking to an application. I mean, you have to think about it, you have to know about it, but it's not like you have to write the TCP/IP stack yourself anymore. Yeah,
correct. And even complicated things like load balancing and stuff like that, it should be relatively easy to be able to go, I would like this application to work on 2 containers instead of 1, and to have a single VIP IP address as the front end, or having a round robin, or like those sort of things should just be something you can grab a component of. And it's something that Amazon has been very good at providing to people. Is that those little self-contained services still way too complex to adopt and require you actually have some skills, but if you think about them going forward, things like CloudFormation and stuff like that, which is sort of infrastructure building blocks, like where you are, like I would like 1 of these and 2 of these and 3 of these, that should be the way we should be thinking about infrastructure.
Yeah, make it as simple as possible, but not too simple, I guess. So you've done a lot of writing as well. We were talking about that before we got on stage.
Yes.
Written books on Docker and more stuff, I think.
Written 7 technical books.
Yeah.
So a couple on Puppet, 1 on Docker, some Linux sysadmin sort of books, a monitoring book many years ago, and I'm working on another monitoring book at the moment.
So how did you get into the book writing side of things?
I'm honestly not sure I remember precisely. It's more than 10 years ago now.
Sure.
And my brain is I think at the time I was working heavily on Linux system security, and there wasn't a lot of good books out there.
No.
And I decided, maybe I should write something, and I started writing some stuff down. And a friend of mine who was going to co-write the book with me said, we should get a publisher and we should do all this sort of stuff. And I was like, okay. We approached the publisher and gave them a pitch, and all of a sudden I have a contract and they want me to write a book.
Now what?
Now what? I actually have to write a book. And it was a pretty sort of, it was a pretty sort of scary experience at first.
I bet.
But I realized that I realized that I think I'm reasonably good at it, and B, one of the most frustrating things about our industry is there's a lot of really useful knowledge trapped in the minds of some very, very smart people.
Oh yes.
And there's an old William Gibson line: "The future is not evenly distributed."
No.
In our industry, knowledge is not evenly distributed. So my objective was to try and write things, and almost all the things I write are very much aimed at, getting people to understand basic concepts. Lowest common denominator. I don't write very, very technical books aimed at technical people. I am books that say, here's a technology like Docker. If I am an average application developer or a web developer, how might I learn about this in such a way that I can work out how it's useful to me without becoming an infrastructure expert?
Yeah. That's a really good way to aim, I think.
And some people I get, every now and again I'll get a review of a book that sort of says, this was too simple. It was an introduction. And I'm like, yes. Congratulations, I am successful.
Exactly. Perfect. I'm so happy for you. Well.
No, I want all of this detail, and I'm like, okay, this is not the book for you then.
No, exactly. And there is such a need for, introductions to things that start from some kind of sensible low base level and sort of build naturally upward.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things you don't, if you look at the vast majority of programming books, they really are like, unless you're looking at some specialized set of patterns or something specific, I don't know a programming book that doesn't start with the same simple, hello world-ish, this is a variable, this is how you assign a value to it, example, right?
Yeah.
They don't assume that they might assume you have some prior programming knowledge, like conceptual knowledge, but they don't assume you understand how the syntax works. Or, I think there's a niche for books that are more complex, but I think we have enough of a challenge with getting people educated about technology full stop, not just in the industry, that the more simple books out there.
And I mean, so often if someone can explain sort of the thinking around something really well, then you can go to the detailed API documentation and figure out the details when you need them. So I don't think there's the same kind of need for books about those very low-level parts, perhaps.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting stuff. I mean, there's some classic books. Like if you look at some of the classic Unix systems programming books, people go, these are quite complex books, and I'm like, yeah, they are, but they're not actually. If you look at the way they're structured and written, and Dennis Ritchie is a real example of this, is that they're very conceptual books. They teach you the Unix way of doing things, and obviously, you end up having to be quite technical, but you finish the book going, this is how this fits together, in such a way that you're right. It's not API documentation. You've learnt a methodology and an approach as well as a bunch of technical information.
Yeah, and it sort of stands alone as well. You can figure it out. The book actually teaches you this thing. Yeah, I talked to Dan Friedman the other day. About his book writing, and he was also into those things like the book should stand alone and you should build up the thinking and teach you something that way. So kind of.
I also assume that some people will never finish the book, right? They will read a couple of chapters and go, I understand enough to do what I want to do.
Yeah,
and after that, I don't care.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way of thinking about when you're building a table of contents for a book, is think about who is going to get all the way through the book and put the stuff that no one cares about at the end.
More of the reference.
Small group of people.
If you need this, it's here.
Plus, the content changes really quickly too. Like if I built a reference manual for Docker, and I wrote most of the original Docker documentation with a couple of my colleagues, it changed every day. So if I'm documenting API endpoints in a book,
never done. I guess maybe that's one of the reasons people don't put more work into writing well and documenting things deeply in our industry, because you always have this feeling that this changes so quickly anyway.
I think also developers are inherently lazy people.
Yes.
And documentation is not high on their list of priorities. I find that I manage a team of engineers. I think we have a pretty high bar for documentation, and it's, we care very much about onboarding and getting people to understand how things work. And as a result, there's lots of information out there about how things work, but it's definitely not 100% of information. And I've worked in organizations where new developers have to sink or swim, right? No documentation. You can't introspect the API. You have no idea why prior decisions were made except digging through commit logs and I think we've all seen the commit message that says fix this problem, or
trying something else,
or shit. That's if you're a brand new developer and you read that code, that's not useful to you.
No,
right?
it doesn't help
the
that
commit
much.
message that says shit.
Doesn't help me either, actually.
Okay, and a year later, you're not going to remember why you did that, or
a week later.
But
is that something you work a lot with, like sort of raising the bar for documentation, or
I try to do it in the communities that I'm involved in. Like I think my largest contribution to most of the open source projects I've worked on has been sort of documentation. And I try and if I use somebody's tool, or I try and leave it in a better state. Like if I have to puzzle something out, and they have some way for me to document the thing I puzzled out, then I tend to my commit back tends to be more documentation than code. Because someone else is going to have the same problem, right?
Sure, always.
There's nothing like reading through 40 posts on a mailing list where everyone has asked the same question and no one has an answer. I'm like, oh God, I'm just going to write that down somewhere, reply to this thread and go, here is some documentation. But I think we have, as engineers, we have an obligation to look at our profession as well-rounded, and by well-rounded I mean not just writing amazing code, but actually write code comments and tests and standards and styles and having style guides and then documentation. All of those things to varying levels of depth are aspects of being an engineer. And one of the reasons the engineering world, the capital E engineering world, finds computer science such a, we'll call it somewhat lackadaisical science, is that in any other industry, like a mechanical engineer or a civil engineer, you can't do anything without documentation. No civil engineer builds a bridge without a really detailed plan, a list of every single component and how it fits together, and tolerances, and then test plans, and we're the only industry that calls itself engineering where this isn't a base requirement. And you could argue that some of the things we build aren't as important as a bridge. And sure, not everybody's building aircraft control software.
Fortunately,
but some people are.
Yeah, exactly.
In which case, the tolerances should be acceptably high. And more of the technology we use becomes critical to the way we live. Like whether it's if a bank, let's say a Swedish bank has an ATM outage, right? And half of Stockholm can't get into an ATM. Like that paralyzes a city. Particularly, let's say Scandinavia is a good example of this, where point of sale systems are pretty much like very few people outside of smaller businesses carry cash, right? Cards run. If your point of sale system crashes, like there are a significant number of people for whom like a weekend of a point of sale system means may not be able to buy food.
No.
And I think that there's whether it's the transport industry or the finance industry, or even simple things like how much of your job could you get done if your email doesn't work?
Well, for me, it's like, peace.
Sorry, you are a developer. This is true. But for your business as a whole, without email, your business stops.
We're out.
It's the same places where your phone was or the fax was 20 years ago, or 30 years ago. So, from my point of view, a higher level of tolerance and a higher level of precision needs to be applied to our profession.
So like documentation-wise, do you think there's anything? A good place to start, basically, to improve your documentation and writing processes in our projects. Is there anything particular we could?
I think actually it's really simple. I think there's the first thing you need to do is you need to explain what your thing does, and what it doesn't do, and then you need to explain to people how they install it and get started with it. And then if you've got those things down, then you start to look at use cases and you say to people, this is how you do, whether it be a how-to, this is how you do various things. Here's how the API fits together. Big believer in self-documenting APIs and introspect APIs, particularly ones that sort of spit out like, here is the JSON that goes in, here is the JSON that comes out. Makes testing really easy. But I think having that very basic thing of often I'll open a GitHub project and there's a title and a line of text, and it's like gem install something or pip install something, and I'm like, that's it? That's in the documentation? and the response from the developer is, I'll go read the code. And I'm okay, that's great. What if I'm using this and I don't write the language that you've written your utility in, or I'm a junior person and some of the code doesn't make sense to me?
There are a million reasons.
And to write maybe 10 paragraphs of documentation that sort of say, this is what it does, this is how I install it, this is how it works, this is how you get started with it. That's it. It's not an expensive exercise.
No. And then the next question, of course. Okay, say I start writing stuff. So where do I put it so it ends up in the right hands?
Well, it depends. I mean, I think that readmes in repositories are a healthy start. I firmly recommend to people, if they're building tools, that they create a website. And I think one of the reasons that I use this example all the time, but are you familiar with a tool called Vagrant?
So
HashiCorp was a Mitchell Hashimoto. One of the things about the HashiCorp tools is they all come with amazing documentation. And I think their adoption has been significantly enhanced by the fact that the documentation explains just how it works and just works out of the box. So I think having a nice website, having a way for people to be able to navigate. Lots of pictures are useful. I think even drawing simple diagrams, like this bit goes into this bit and stuff comes out there. You like conceptually allow people to grasp things a lot more quickly than they would otherwise.
But I feel like a problem I've seen, which is where this question came from, of course, is that a group of developers, we have a sense that we don't write enough documentation. It's clear that some stuff we want to communicate doesn't get out. But if we started writing this, I mean, we have our source code repositories and stuff, and maybe we have a wiki somewhere, but we don't really have a feeling that these are the right ways to reach the other people around us, the people inside our company, and then maybe later on, I'm writing this now. I know the customer will want to know about this thing, and sort of a sense that there should be some kind of way for me to write something and put it over here and say that this is for other people. It may not be polished for customers, but
so I think here's an example that I use to people all the time. A couple of projects I work on have 3 types of documentation. One set is auto-generated out of the commands and the API and stuff like that, and it's reference material. It when you deploy a new version, it automatically builds the website that has all of the list of all the API endpoints and what happens to them. It has sort of how-to and use case documentation that's maybe not polished, but and that automatically gets published to a wiki. Every time you update, and it's the documentation lives in the source code tree and a docs directory. It's Markdown uses Jekyll, creates a website from it. And the last one is there's a README, and the README basically says here's how the basics of it work, and here's the pointer to the docs. Here's the things that are missing from the docs, like a little to-do. Here's the API documentation, and here's how the current versions work, and like that. I think set the basics of that up. In most projects, it's probably half a day's work, right? Maybe self-documenting API stuff. I mean, but
it's
how Java doc.
you don't need to do it all at once
different
either.
ways you could do doc strings. Name me a programming language that doesn't have doc strings.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. This is a relatively simple fix. I mean, you could spike on. It's a matter of investing time. You could spike on simple documentation for most of your app. In a very quick period of time.
Yeah. Then I guess the rest is the usual, communication and.
And you do stuff like new people have to leave the documentation better than they found it, right? So every
exactly.
time a new person onboards, they obviously have to build a development instance of the app. Like document the process, make sure it works.
And does it fit together with what the last person wrote about the process? No, this has changed and that thing and
exactly.
Documentation important. I think we're about done.
Okay,
thank you so much.
No problems.
It was a pleasure.